Welcome to this special episode of Film Seizure at the Movies. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the Film Seizure podcast that you can catch each Wednesday morning with my cohorts, Jason Oliver and Chuck Moore, as well as my solo show, Monster Mondays, that you can listen to each Monday afternoon. And you can listen to both of those shows at filmseizure.com. Now, allow me, if you will, to take you back to a time in which these two syllables, Star Wars, was not met with a deluge of opinions about what went right and wrong with sequels and prequels and angry comments about what was influenced by politics or what characters are despised and so forth. It also probably likely didn't elicit exasperated sighs of frustration that indicated that person who let out that moan might think that you are, quote, one of those people. But yes, today is twice over an important date. You see, for May 25th, 1977 was the day the Star Wars Trilogy began. Likewise, May 25th, 1983, 40 years ago today, it also ended with the release of The Return of the Jedi. Being a 46-year-old guy and 3.5 months older than the first film itself, Star Wars, before it was officially retitled to Star Wars Episode 4 A New Hope, was always with me. There are 4 movies that I can never even come close to describing the first time I ever saw because they were always a part of my memory and a part of my pop culture lexicon. Star Wars, Superman, Star Trek the Motion Picture, and The Black Hole. Now notice, all 4 of those movies have a sci-fi element to them. But anyway, I'm told that Superman was the first movie that I was taken to as a baby, accompanying my parents and brothers at the drive-in. And by the way, parents, if you live somewhere a drive-in is somewhat nearby and you miss going to the movies because of cost, or you have a baby or whatever, go to a drive-in. That's a great place for kids and babies. Far better than movie theaters. But I digress. I don't remember seeing Superman at the drive-in. I was way too young. The other 3, I couldn't tell you when I saw them, but they probably played on cable or TV or were rentable from early video stores or what have you. Now, one thing I do know is that my brothers had a Super 8 projector, and they had some movies in the shortened forms, and one of those was Star Wars. Now, these were really short, so it required having multiple reels of these movies if you wanted to see more than a single scene or action sequence. And so when I say the really condensed versions of these movies, they're like, I think 200-foot reels, which only equals about 3 minutes or so. It was an easy way to relive exciting moments of some of the movies that came out during the height of people having Super 8 projectors, and especially during a time in which you couldn't rent it or cable wasn't available to everybody, or if you had a VCR, you would have had to have had a blank tape and you'd had to remember to press record when it played on TV and so forth. That was the way things were back then. No streaming. Like I said, if you had cable, it would probably be at least a year or more after the release in theaters that cable would pick things up to play. It wouldn't be on broadcast television for several years. If you didn't want to go to the movies all the time, or you couldn't go to the movies anytime that you wanted, or you didn't have money, etc., you kind of had to rely on other things to relive these movies. Novelizations, comic book adaptations, or these Super 8 reels. And if you didn't have any of those, well, you might have to resort to a Viewmaster where you would be just looking at frames of the movie. And sometimes that worked. That was a good way of remembering specific moments and scenes and characters within a movie. But still, the moments of that first Star Wars film had back then and still to this day hold a large portion of my memory of being a kid. That first film in particular came at an important time as a whole to American culture. The mid to late 70s were pretty rough. First, you had the end of the Vietnam War, which wasn't too great for our national pride. Then you had inflation and an energy and fuel crisis. Star Wars told an old-fashioned hero story in a way, and really told that story in a way that looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It's actually wild how simplistic the story is and how familiar. The boy from the Boondocks who will become a great hero, a damsel in distress, a princess, no less, a savvy pirate with a heart of gold, and bad guys. Oh, these bad guys are pretty arch. Their entire existence is built around seemingly doing evil. But Darth Vader, now, that's a guy that you couldn't ever forget what he looked like once you saw him for the first time. In fact, for decades, I've had a recurring nightmare that comes up maybe at least once or twice a year since I was a kid, that I was being hunted down by Vader, and I would wake up just before he'd come around the corner that I was hiding behind after igniting that blood red lightsaber of his to find me. For kids like me, who wouldn't want to have their very own droids to hang out with, do their chores, and be their best friends? I mean, C-3PO is whatever, I guess. I mean, he was always kind of prissy and kind of annoying. But R2-D2 was every little kid's best friend. He helped Luke Skywalker fly his X-Wing ship. He often acted as a deus ex machina whenever our heroes were in trouble. His beeps and tweets and whistles were friendly and warm. So how could you not want to cuddle that little tin can? For all the groundbreaking elements that make the original 1977 Star Wars film so amazing, as a stunning achievement in filmmaking, yes. A perfectly timed release to lift people out of the mire of a fairly depressing decade, yes. A movie that so clearly and easily defined good and evil, yes. A vision of futuristic space travel and robots and galaxy-spanning government bodies that may be in conflict, but most definitely not apocalyptic in setting, yes. I do find the first film in the trilogy to actually be the slowest moving, kind of poorly paced, and least interesting to, I don't know, I guess as an overall entertainment experience. This might be due to a couple of things. First, as I mentioned, there is no memory of me seeing this movie for the very first time. It was kind of always part of my life. So it's incredibly familiar to me, like hearing someone tell me the same story time and time again without changing it up, changing up some of the method or the words or the details used to tell that story. Second, and you can hear this directly from old making of documentaries interviewing Harrison Ford, Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and George Lucas himself, this first film is entirely George's style. George Lucas is extremely good at building a world and monsters and things that inhabit these worlds. He's kind of a brilliant idea person. However, he's not exactly a great writer of dialogue. If you need any more evidence of that, look at this movie and the prequel trilogy and compare it against the second and third installments of this trilogy that had heavy involvement from Lawrence Kasdan. It was also said that he was not particularly keen on the actors' points of view. Ford, Hamill, and Fisher each independently liked to speak on some of the complicated nature of the dialogue that Lucas included in the first film's final script. Quote, faster and more intense was the typical piece of direction that Lucas would give his actors. They were mostly expected to know what he wanted from what was in the script itself, and it kind of shows. The dialogue is kind of stilted without a great deal of cinematic oomph, for a lack of a better term, I guess. Now, what I do absolutely love about the original Star Wars, and I want to be very clear about the word original, as I feel the special editions that began to be released in 1997 feel different in a lot of ways because of the melding of new things that got inserted into the films. Anyway, whatever. What I love about 1977 Star Wars is how lived in the entire world looked. The Jawas roll around Tatooine in a giant mobile tank that also acts as a little bit of a storage facility and, I guess, a mobile encampment. But the wheels and the treads have caked on grime and dirt and dried sand. When Luke and his Uncle Owen are buying C-3PO and R2-D2 from the Jawas, smoke spews out of the wheels and from under the sandcrawler vehicle. The inside of it is dark and dingy and grimy like a workshop would be. 3PO and R2 also look to be dripping oil and are covered with dirt as well. The stormtroopers who are looking for the droids after they escaped their ship from that exciting opening attack by a Star Destroyer are covered with dirt. While stormtroopers have armor in pristine condition on the Death Star later on, the Galactic Empire looks to be aging and kind of crumbling from the looks of the troopers on the planet's surface. It's different on the Death Star as it needs to look perfect and polished, and a sign that the Empire is an unstoppable force that the Rebel Alliance is struggling against. But still, if you take things away from those forceful signs and you have these individuals on the planet's surface, they don't look well put together. They look very dirty, and it all builds that kind of lived in. It's telling you things by how the world looks and how people interact with it. Even Darth Vader himself doesn't look as shiny as he would in the sequels. His helmet is smudged with fingerprints, and his armor doesn't look quite as bulletproof and pristine as it would, especially in the opening scenes of Return of the Jedi. Star Wars looks different than any other entry in the entire saga. It's not just because it was a film made by 1977 standards in the more dramatic sequences, but even in the special effects. It looks as though it was all very barely pulled off. Again, go look at some of the documentaries made, like From Star Wars to Jedi, the making of the saga, or the excellent Empire of Dreams, both of which you can find in their entirety on YouTube to see how people working on the effect shots were even kind of surprised that they even pulled it off. Still, there are undeniably impactful moments still 46 years on. Luke pondering his place in the galaxy and his desires while looking at the setting twin suns of Tatooine. Han Solo's introduction and having a shootout in the cantina against Greedo. Princess Leia watching her home planet being destroyed by the Death Star. Obi-Wan Kenobi sacrificing himself to allow for our young heroes to get away from the Death Star. Luke's heroic moment in destroying the Death Star, and the following award ceremony celebrating his and Han Solo's heroic actions. All these moments are really what that first Star Wars is about for me. It's not the awkward dialogue at times, or the curious pace that feels slow, or its familiarity that can sometimes lull me into a nap. No, it's a film that I really wish I could have been able to have been old enough to remember seeing for the first time on a big screen, because this is a movie whose reputation precedes it, but also lives up to it all these decades later. There is no other movie that looks or sounds like Star Wars, and no other movie that can be so pre-descriptive of what you think the content, of what the content will be with a title like that. And yet, 3 years later, I think most people would agree on, at least on a story and character level, all of that was topped. Now, we've covered 1980's The Empire Strikes Back on Film Seizure. It was our 150th episode. I kind of jokingly said this was the movie in the trilogy that maybe gets talked about the least. I've often mentioned it's often mentioned as the favorite of the three. However, it's the groundbreaking impact of the first film, or the Ewoks, or the final showdown between Luke and Vader, that I think makes the other two movies mentioned a little bit more in conversation. It's almost like The Empire Strikes Back is just the middle chapter and therefore has a lot of weight to carry, and is just kind of just mentioned and left as most everyone's favorite, and we don't need to really go into more of that, and they just move on to the other movies. The movie also tied to some very, very early memories of mine. First of all, I have a memory of playing outside one early summer day and my mom telling me to come inside and get cleaned up because we were going to go to the movie theater to watch Empire Strikes Back. I have no idea if this is a true memory or a dream or whatever, but considering it would have been I would have been a little over 3 years old, it would make some sense that I would have some ability to remember something like that. There have been many movies that my mom took me to as a little kid, and it all makes sense that she would have specifically taken me to see that one, as my brothers would have been old enough to go on their own and not have a tiny brother to look after as well. The other element that becomes part of my earliest memories is that for Christmas of 1980, I got a lot of Empire Strikes Back toys. Now, for the first movie, one of my brothers had a lot of the figures, maybe a few of the ships. But as a family, I definitely remembered the Death Star playset that was multi-tiered and such. We having that. Who had everything, I'm not entirely sure. I think, it might have just been my three brothers had stuff that they kind of shared with each other. I don't know. But for The Empire Strikes Back, I remember opening the present that was the Millennium Falcon. I had a ton of the figures, Yoda's Homestead playset, and some of the stuff from the ice planet Hoth. I definitely remember having bedding with Empire Strikes Back imagery on it. Now, whether or not I got it for Empire Strikes Back or later from Return of the Jedi, I had, which was my favorite Star Wars toy, the AT-AT Walker. Those were the big walkers that were best remembered for the attack on the Rebel base on Hoth in the first act of Empire Strikes Back. I love those things so much. I always thought of mine as kind of like my pet dog. I mean, they look like dogs, so why not think of that toy as a robotic version of a dog? Maybe I was already in tune with Doctor Who, since the fourth Doctor also had the robotic dog named K9. But what I always loved about Empire Strikes Back, even back when I was a kid and before I could really kind of think critically enough about the movie to realize that it really was superior on a narrative level, was the different locations of the movie. The bright white snow-covered landscape of Hoth was a favorite of mine. I think it's probably my favorite because at the time, and still maybe something I think about mostly today, Hoth is something I can kind of identify with. I live in Indiana, somewhere that it's not uncommon to have several snow-covered days in the winter. Plus, that was the scene in which the AT-ATs were found and the snow speeders were taking them on and everything. And I really loved the snow speeder vehicle too. They felt and looked sleek and something that was much less a spacefaring fighter and something that's would have much higher purpose in a ground assault. In addition, I loved the look of the outfits worn by the stormtroopers on Hoth. I think they were called snowtroopers, but they didn't have the normal helmet that looked more skull-like. They had what appeared to be like a vinyl or leather hood that kind of like a hooded feature of sorts, I guess, on the front of the helmet. And they also like almost looked like they had like long coats on as well. Then, as they're led through the corridors of the Rebel base on Hoth, the stark contrast of the snowy and white halls and walls, we have Darth Vader in all black striding down just as Han Solo, Chewbacca, and Princess Leia are trying to get to the Millennium Falcon to fly away. Even the creatures of Hoth are interesting, with the beastly Wampa that wanted to make a meal out of Luke Skywalker and the friendly Tauntauns that were used almost like horses to get around the planet. Now, my next favorite location in the movie was Cloud City. The concept of this huge structure that was in the sky and not a terrestrial type of location made it feel really futuristic. It's actually kind of a classic science fiction idea where you would have a city of cultured people living above ground. It's only later that I realized that Bespin is a gas giant type of planet. So there was no terrestrial location on the planet, and Cloud City was a mining facility. But I always loved the various hallways and almost maze-like like interiors of Cloud City. It's the one thing that was changed by the special edition that I didn't mind quite as much, as the visuals removed a lot of the walls and made them into windows to look out at the lovely orange skies of that gas giant. I always liked the setting for that final climax where Lando Calrissian is had to help Leia and Chewbacca and the droids escape from the Imperial troops after Han Solo is frozen in carbonite to be delivered to Jabba the Hutt. And then you have Luke arriving to battle Darth Vader for the first time. The sheer size and immensity of Cloud City was kind of a wonder to me when I was younger. That structure had multiple set pieces and settings that were each very distinct in looks. It clearly was a beneficiary of Lucas wanting to expand his story. Now, of course, the third setting was Dagobah, where Luke would find and be mentored by the great Jedi Master Yoda. The swampy moon was dark and it looked humid and probably smelled bad. However, it was loaded with reptiles and lizards and vegetation that you'd expect to find like in a bog or a bayou. While I still think there was so much more later films could have done with that cave where Luke went into and ended up being taken on by a vision of Darth Vader who was actually really just Luke himself under the helmet. The most important thing in this location is Yoda himself, and Yoda is the kind of classic misdirection, something so small, seemingly feeble, and kind of an awkward orator, and who really turns out to be powerful and teaches both Luke and us, the viewers, about the Force and its power, and understanding that the best way to determine what is the dark side or the light would be in the quiet moments of reflection and simply listening to what it tells you and following what you feel is right. And what's surprising, and something else you can hear about in some of those behind the scenes documentaries about the trilogy, and one in particular about Empire, is that Lucas was terrified Yoda wasn't going to work. It had to be a puppet, and it had to be done in that way to make the whole idea even possible. But he said right up until the first scene with Frank Oz puppeting and speaking for Yoda, and all of that was filmed, he considered scrapping the whole idea. We almost take Yoda for granted today. I mean, even Baby Yoda on The Mandalorian is a puppet and animatronic most of the time. However, it's clear that when Lucas says that if Yoda didn't work, the whole movie would fall apart and be laughed out of theaters. And he's right. It works almost as a fluke. If we knew before seeing him in a preview or in a picture that a literal puppet was going to be a massively important character, and it was going to be voiced by the guy who does Miss Piggy, we would have thought The Empire Strikes Back would fall into the very same traps all sequels tended to fall into up until that point. Yet, it worked. It worked so well that we are tricked into thinking Yoda is a living being, even if our brains tell us that we absolutely know for a fact that that creature is a puppet. It's one piece of this movie that expands our own understanding of what this galaxy far, far away is like. One of the amazing things about this trilogy, and something that is maybe only matched by Star Trek, is how we know there is makeup and costumes and creatures made out of latex and meant to be worn like it's Halloween, and yet they look real, even when we know it isn't. The locations, the machinery, the ships, the interiors of ships or bases, and and those creatures living within this galaxy all look and act and feel real. But before we actually talk about the movie that inspired this whole special episode, one thing I do want to mention was that the beneficiary of Lucas now being able to say, okay, I built the world with Star Wars, even if he wasn't totally happy with everything, even if it's a movie that had to be saved in editing because of how kind of dry it really is. The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi really benefited from the fact that Lucas now had the ability to say, I've set the world, now it's time to populate the world. And that's what makes Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi really pretty special movies, because again, it kind of comes down to all of that stuff looking and feeling real. Well, a lot of that is solely based on the fact that we are so interested by what exists in this world and these creatures, and the ability to say, I don't have to build the world anymore. Now I just have to fill it. That's a great position for somebody to be in as a creative person. So let's actually now celebrate the 40th birthday of Return of the Jedi. Now, there's something that you really need to understand about me and my relationship to Return of the Jedi. While Star Wars was something that's always been with me to the point that I do not possess a memory of the first time I saw it due to its ever-present nature in my life, The Empire Strikes Back is among some of the very best space opera science fiction adventure that's ever been produced and placed on screen. But when it comes to Return of the Jedi, it's something like another sibling in my life. I was 6 years old when Return of the Jedi blasted out onto screens and multiplexes all over the country. I'd be shocked if I didn't see it for the first time on the first or second day of release. It was something that wasn't, just my mom taking me to the theater alone. It was also my brothers and my aunt, I think, even joined us. This was the first time I remember a movie being an event. It was also the first movie I remember the media and tie-in merchandising blitz as well. Anything that could slap the logo for Return of the Jedi on it, I wanted, and likely got a lot of it. I had figures, vehicles, and coloring books, and comic books, and all the general stuff that almost every kid would get. But it went further than that and became a part of my life in my bedroom furnishings and wardrobe. I had at least probably 4 or 5 t-shirts that featured characters from the movie on it. It was so much a part of my whole thing. And this is another one of those kind of vague memories I have, but it is somewhat clear. I remember one time I was at a store with my mom, and I'm guessing it was probably our local Zare or possibly Target, but I remember seeing a teacher of mine there. And I remember it was, chit chat talking about like, oh, what are you here for? And oh, hi, Geoff's mom and all of that stuff. And I showed her that I was getting a couple of more t-shirts that had Return of the Jedi stuff on it. And she made the comment that, of course, that is what I was going to be getting for t-shirts. I have no idea what the shirts were, but I know I had quite a few that even my teacher would comment on. Oh, you're getting more of those, huh? But anyway, I also had 3 pieces of furniture that remained with me for years after the film's release, one of which is still in my living room to this day and will always have a place wherever it is that I live. That piece is a 3-shelf bookcase that had the Return of the Jedi logo on the sides and on each shelf. And on the back of the inside part of each shelf are artist renditions of 3 key locations of the film, which I'll talk about shortly. I also had a round table that had Return of the Jedi art on the top and 2 small child-sized chairs that went with the table. And I also had the R2-D2 toy toter, which was just a big round toy chest of sorts that was in the shape of R2-D2 and had wheels. On days that I wanted to specifically feel like the diminutive Kenny Baker, I'd climb inside the toy toter and pretend to be R2-D2. But perhaps my favorite tie-in product, those were the Pepperidge Farms cookies that came out in flavors vanilla, peanut butter, and chocolate. The cookies themselves were in shapes of characters. The vanilla figures, or the vanilla cookies, had the shape of Luke, Leia, Han, Yoda, Wicket the Ewok on them. The peanut butter cookies had the rest of the good guys like Chewbacca, C-3PO, R2-D2, Admiral Akbar, and for whatever reason, it had Max Rebo's band. Now, Max Rebo was like this little blue guy. And he was like the band leader for the other characters. I can't remember what the third guy's name is, but the singer was Sice Noodles, and they had cookies of them in the peanut butter ones. The chocolate cookies were the bad guys. You had Darth Vader, Jabba the Hutt, Gamorrean Guard, and one of the Emperor's royal guardsmen. I don't think there actually was one of the Emperor himself. What was funny about the Emperor was that there were very little things that tied into him directly. It was almost like maybe they either were saving him for just see the movie, because even the figure you had to send off for. You couldn't buy the figure out at the store. You had to collect pieces and then send off the UPC codes or whatever. And maybe it was that they were concerned that the Emperor was a scary figure or a scary character for people. But anyway, I love these cookies, and I ate a ton of all of those flavors. And I think I probably ate most of them at my dad's place. I don't know. I just remember eating them there at his place from time to time. But it's also important to understand that I was the perfect age for this movie. So much so, in fact, and this is a hugely minority opinion, I actually quite like the Ewoks. It's always a thing that people like to point out as for why this movie is not as good as the others. How did the Empire get destroyed by a bunch of teddy bears? That was a common refrain from older fans. Honestly, if you look later on in the Star Wars saga, I don't hate Jar Jar Binks for the same reason why I can't hate the Ewoks. Little 6-year-old kids are going to see the more comedic or cutesy presence and kind of gravitate towards them. I'm happy to admit that Jar Jar is a bad character and doesn't work for 1999's The Phantom Menace. Just as quickly as I can say that The Return of the Jedi is the inferior of the 3 original trilogy movies, but that's because Star Wars and Empire Strikes Back are just that good. I can also admit that Ewoks are not going to be as appealing to the older viewers, just like Jar Jar Binks was not appealing to me as an older viewer, even though I can't hate him because I know why he's there. But allow me to actually talk about the movie itself. I feel this movie is divisible by its 3 main set pieces and the 3 acts that also help break that up. To me, the real crown jewels of this movie come in the opening act when Luke and company return to Tatooine to deal with Jabba the Hutt and save Han Solo, and the final act where the 3-part attack on the new Death Star, the Imperial troops on Endor, and Luke faces his father and the Emperor jumps into hyperdrive to bring this trilogy to its satisfying conclusion. The second act where our heroes are interacting on Endor is probably my least favorite of the 3 though, but like I say, I do like me some Ewoks. You know, I do want to cuddle some of those little bastards, especially the baby Ewoks. But and the second act does feature that really brilliant speeder bike chase. Also, my favorite stormtroopers are the biker scouts. I love their helmets so much. But that second act is a lot of setting the pieces up. You know, you have a big explosive first act, which sometimes I admit, if you really want to get me thinking really critical about this movie, the first act has very little to do with the rest of the act. It's almost like it's like an extra half an hour that is wrapping up Empire Strikes Back business before it actually gets to the Return of the Jedi business. But that second act is the act that happens in between 2 big action set pieces. But that first act with Jabba's palace and the big action when they have to escape is absolutely my favorite act of all Star Wars ever. The Empire Strikes Back is all around a better movie and great to the point that I can't pick and choose whole acts, quite like with Return of the Jedi. And the general world building of the first Star Wars is really about second to none. But the Jabba the Hutt action is quintessential Star Wars for me. Again, I was 6 years old at the time. It's big action, and it's got, you have the slimy worm gangster barge and palace that is loaded with creatures and monsters. They're mean looking and dressed in weird ways, and He even has a house band that I mentioned earlier. Max Rebo's a little blue elephant guy who plays what I guess is a space synthesizer. I love it. I just love all these characters, that every inch of the screen is got something to look at. And that slimy worm gangster Jabba the Hutt himself. I mean, good Lord, what a marvelous creation that I think had at least 3 or 4 people operating him. We heard the name Jabba the Hutt since the first film. When we finally see him, he lives up to how vile and gross we think of him as being, as just a gangster we've heard the name of. And he also has Salacious B. Crumb, his little cackling sidekick that gets to hang out with him and his slave girls. All my life, I've wanted a Salacious Crumb puppet. Seriously, if I had one of those, I'd become one of those weirdos that walks around with a puppet all the time to interact with people as both the puppet and goofy-ass me. But we also have the bigger creatures that help Jabba make examples of people who anger him. The terrible Sarlacc that lives in a pit in the sand and eats people. And then you have under Jabba's throne room in his palace, you have the giant Rancor, who is kind of like part Godzilla and part something you think Ray Harryhausen would have created in a movie 20 years earlier. But all of that pales to the exciting escape from Jabba. Jabba plans on dumping Luke and Han into the Sarlacc pit, but Luke, he's no dummy. He stashed his lightsaber in R2-D2 and does an acrobatic jump and flip, and people are sliced all to hell by his lightsaber. We saw Luke try to use bravado to defeat Jabba earlier in the movie. We can see the confidence in him in his black Jedi garb and the way he presents himself and the way he talks. But once he starts taking command of the whole situation on the skiff and then on Jabba's barge, we see Luke fully realized as a Jedi Knight. He takes down an entire criminal organization and all the troops and lieutenants single-handedly. I mean, sure, Leia struggles Jabba in a pretty badass moment for our princess, but Luke kills 50 guys with laser guns, with gymnastics, and just a laser sword. It's amazing. Just an amazing scene that makes me feel like I'm 6 all over again when it breaks out on the screen. The final act also fills me with childlike glee and at times chills. I love the battle in the forest between the rebels and the Ewoks taking on the Imperial troops. I love the whole elements of Han and Leia and Chewie trying to get into the command center that controls the shield that protects the Death Star. All of that is interesting and fun as we see something that we've often seen in various Earthbound battles. In real life, the lesser army using its knowledge of a landscape and their own ways to defeat a superior army. In addition to that, we have Lando and the Millennium Falcon leading the charge to destroy the new Death Star. That fight was more than anything else you had seen up to that point, as TIE fighters come out to take on the Rebel Alliance fleet. It looks like hundreds and hundreds of fighters flying at you and flying in the background and cutting in between shots of ships that you're focusing on. It's so fast and frenetic, you can almost gasp at the scene's speed. So while you get some chuckles from the battle on Endor and you're exhilarated by the space battle outside the Death Star, your chance to catch your breath is during the battle between Vader and Luke while the evil Emperor Palpatine pulls the strings in the throne room of his giant space station. It's hard to even say you are catching your breath because while the action slows down to a personal battle between father and son and destiny, this is where you're hanging on every moment and word of dialogue when it happens. Luke has no interest in killing his father. He's going to save him. He's only forced into fighting Vader because Vader discovers something we learned from a dying Yoda in Obi-Wan Kenobi's ghost earlier in the movie. Leia is Luke's sister. Now, of course, there's the whole thing about, they kissed each other a few times, and there's all sorts of kind of slipshod kind of continuity stuff being played with that sometimes are made into bigger issues or into bigger events in later movies, but whatever. Leia and Luke are brother and sister. They didn't know that until this movie. But Vader basically says, well, I don't have to basically win Luke to my side. I mean, he can even kill Luke if he wants to, because he can then go to his daughter and try to twist her into becoming an evil servant of the dark side of the Force. All the drama, all the heart, and all the conflict set up by the climax of The Empire Strikes Back comes down to these scenes where Luke has to hold his anger and inexperience in check as he tries to save Vader from his darker alter ego. Having Vader save Luke from the Emperor and eventually having his final moments of life lived as a Jedi and the Jedi Anakin Skywalker, this is a crescendo to the entire dramatic weight of the trilogy. After victory, there is a quiet moment of Luke coming to terms with his completion of his destiny to become a Jedi like his father, as he gives his father a funeral before we finally get our opportunity to celebrate a 6-year journey and 3 films with characters that by this time all feel like family. We think about the adventures of this ragtag group of heroes and what they endured and the groundbreaking things that happened to our eyes as we watched the trilogy that started with a farm boy looking out onto the horizon, questioning his place in it all, and ended with a joyous celebration of the defeat of the oppressive galactic empire. It's an easy moment to cheer as the credits come for the last time and the curtain closes on 3 brilliant films. Return of the Jedi is a shining example of how a trilogy or series can come to a satisfying end and be considered a pretty perfect conclusion. I struggle to call any of these movies perfect, but their qualities make them as close to a perfect adventure series as you could really ever have. These 3 movies changed the way we thought about movies. It was well documented that prior to the late 70s, sequels were often considered less than, with each subsequent sequel to a movie having more and more diminished returns, both at the box office and in quality. But thanks to the Star Wars Trilogy, we think of movies in these kind of terms of a saga. There's a way that you can expand a story by not just trying to fit everything into a single movie. Other franchises have had trilogies of their own, even Star Trek with Star Trek 2, 3, and 4 acting as a trilogy with a start and finish to a larger concept and story between characters. In the Marvel Universe, we have Captain America Civil War, Avengers Infinity War, and Avengers Endgame, telling a 3-part story. While neither quite do the Star Wars styles of world building, then dramatic low point, and then climactic victory, it's clear that there is a trilogy element that even Star Wars has now twice repeated with the prequel and sequel trilogies. Thanks to Star Wars, merchandising is as important to a film aimed at a wide audience and appealing to younger people who come up with Christmas lists as the actual box office receipts. Now, while that element did create some behind-the-scenes strife between Lucas and Lucasfilm producer Gary Kurtz, who produced the first 2 films, but exited after The Empire Strikes Back over conflicting reasons, it's definitely part of a calculated hype and marketing machine for tentpole movies. That's whatever you think the positives and negatives of that strategy are. But believe it or not, within a few years after Return of the Jedi's release, Star Wars mostly faded to the background as other cartoons and toys took center stage in the form of G.I. Joe, He-Man, Transformers, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. There were a ton of stuff like that coming out. And that's just naming those 4, aren't even naming all 4 of the top all of the top toys that came out in the 80s after Return of the Jedi. But I remember the trilogy getting a short special 1-day screening in 1993 that I missed out on due to it, I think, selling out like a couple of weeks in advance to the event. The first sign that maybe something extending the saga of Star Wars beyond these 3 movies started happening in 1995, when the last time these movies would see official VHS and Laserdisc release before being altered. On each tape, there was a piece of a George Lucas interview where he talked about the movie that you watched, but also, I think on the tape for Return of the Jedi, he mentioned that he had plans for a prequel trilogy. But before we got there, in 1997, commemorating the 20th anniversary of A New Hope, the special editions were released in the theaters. Now, these are highly debated on whether or not it's fair to make special effects changes while also making it impossible to obtain the original versions in official form. Some of the added content is relatively harmless. Some of it is kind of bad. Some of it comes across as kind of outright offensive, for a lack of a better term. One moment in particular at the very end of this movie I think is absolutely offensive and doesn't make any sense. When I think about the added stuff added in general to Return of the Jedi, I mean, really these special editions add nothing, to this movie in particular. But it did kind of give us an impression of what we might expect in the prequel trilogy that began in 1999. The effects that would be in play, a lot more digital type of stuff. There are a lot more cutesy and kind of background stuff that's happening on parts of the screen that didn't used to mean anything, especially in A New Hope. It was kind of planting the seeds of what we were going to see. Personally, I try to make it a point to avoid watching the special editions. They don't really add anything. And like I said, Return of the Jedi had the most wide-ranging and nonsensical changes and updates. And that's especially one that I don't like watching in special edition because of those changes. Thankfully, there are relatively easy ways to obtain versions of what is called the despecialized editions of these original films. The original films updated to HD quality for Blu-ray that presents the movie in its original form. I mean, even the original Star Wars does not have the Episode 4 A New Hope part in the crawl that sets up the whole story at the beginning of that. But the simple truth is, since 1999, the release of The Phantom Menace, Star Wars has been omnipresent as a brand without those wilderness years as experienced between 1984 and 1995. So this original trilogy for a long, long time was just all there was. And as time moved on, and especially by the time you got to the early to mid 90s, before those new VHS versions of the original releases came out, it wasn't that popular. Everybody liked Star Wars. If Star Wars was on TV, people would watch it. People owned Star Wars or had a video recording of Star Wars, but it wasn't that big of a deal as it used to be. Other things came along to kind of stoke other imaginations. But once those last VHS releases in 95, and then the special editions in 97, and then the prequels started in 1999, it's been all Star Wars all the time. And there is I don't know. I have conflicting feelings about that. And I could go on for a lot longer talking about this original Star Wars trilogy and all these other things. There is a part of me that wishes that there wasn't ever anything more, even though I have seen some things that range from pretty good to really good, and everything that's come since the prequels began releasing. There's just such a wonderful and beautiful fullness to the story told in these three parts. And honestly, sometimes headcanon is just what you prefer, and the stories that you think now that everybody goes on after Return of the Jedi can be your own, and they can be what it is that you appreciate about the characters without anybody else telling you what happens to these characters. So, like I was saying, there's this kind of wonderful fullness that's done in these three parts, and telling any more kind of puts you in real danger of diluting what made this trilogy so perfect. However, I do believe that Star Wars is something that should be available to each generation or two, and sometimes that means you create new stories with new heroes and new villains. I do have a lot of those conflicting feelings about the prequels and sequels, but I also fully acknowledge that maybe those movies should not be made for me or anyone my age, older, or just slightly younger than me. It should belong to the generations that come after us, the younger kids. The kids that are looking to be wowed by what they're seeing on the big screen. One thing that is true, and maybe something that we can take heart in, is that this original Star Wars trilogy was truly lightning in a bottle. And, it's never really been recaptured the same way, even by itself with the subsequent trilogies. Sure, some things have come close, and I'm looking at you, Lord of the Rings, but nothing like Star Wars had ever come before it, and nothing quite like it has come since. Some things you can try to follow some of the same steps, but the resulting dance ultimately comes out something different. So to borrow a sentiment from a documentary about something else that was lightning in a bottle that had no equal or proper comparative, and that was a documentary called The Complete Beatles. The final shot of Return of the Jedi offered the only attitude for the cast and crew and its worldwide following. It had to be stoically accepted that the original Star Wars trilogy was, in the end, a phenomenon of the late 70s and early 80s. The years and decades beyond were to only feel its influence. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram so you can be made aware of new episodes of our various shows as they drop. You can also follow us at podcast providers like SoundCloud, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spotify, and Audible. You can also listen to the show on YouTube by subscribing there. I really kind of like that last thing. I wish I had Malcolm McDowell's voice to read that final thought there that I totally admit that I ripped off from The Complete Beatles. But I hope you have enjoyed my own personal trip down memory lane to things that go back to my very youngest days that I think about a lot nowadays because of the anniversaries that keep ticking off one right after another. I would love to find out what some of your memories are about these original 3 Star Wars movies. Please comment wherever you're listening to this or hit us up on social media. Like I said, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Just search for Film Seizure. You'll find us there. And tell us some of the things that you reminisce on when watching these classics. Regular movie reviews will be coming throughout the summer and beyond, starting next week with a look at Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. So until then, don't forget to save me the aisle seat, and may the Force be with you.